Prostitution is sometimes described as old as humanity. It certainly was a social and legal problem also in ancient Rome from its very beginning to the Christian era. I'd like to tell you more about some social and legal problems concerning prostitution in ancient Rome, underlining first that prostitution was always legal, both in the most archaic period and also when Rome was already Christian. It has to be underlined that even the very beginnings of Rome are somehow connected with prostitution. Was Lupa, the she-wolf who weaned Romulus and Remus, a prostitute? It is possible because the Latin word lupa can also mean a courtesan, a prostitute. But let us pass to some more real problems. And the first thing, as I said, is that prostitution was a legal and also socially accepted thing. I mean that even the most strict Roman, the most strict Romans thought that prostitution was necessary to contain the lust of man. And for example, Porphyria, in his commentary to Horace's satire, says the famous censor Marcus Cato, when he had seen an honorable man coming out of a brothel, praised him, thinking that lust should be checked legally. Later, however, when he noticed him coming out of the same brothel quite frequently, he said, "Young man, I praised you for coming here occasionally, not for living here." So it was okay to visit a prostitute, but of course it had to be somehow limited. We know quite a lot about Roman prostitution, both from literary and from archaeological sources. If you have visited Pompeii, you must have seen the famous brothel there. It was quite natural for Romans from different classes, from different social strata to visit such places. For example, Cicero in his speech for Marcus Salvius tries to excuse his client, stating, "But if there be anyone who thinks that youth is to be wholly interdicted from amorous with courtesans, he certainly is very strict indeed. I cannot deny what he says, but still he is at variance not only with the license of the present age, but even with the habits of our ancestors, and with what they used to consider allowable. For when was the time when men were not used to act in this manner?" Cicero says. So basically it was socially accepted, and it was so even with Christian writers. St. Augustine, for example, says, "What can be mentioned more sordid, more bereft of decency, or more full of turpitude than prostitutes, procurers, and the other pests of that sort? Remove prostitutes from human affairs," he says, "and you will unsettle everything because of lusts. Place them in the position of matrons, and you will dishonor these latter by disgrace and ignominy. This class of people is therefore, by its own mode of life, most unchaste in its morals. By the law of order, it is most vile in social condition." But he says, remove prostitution, and those sordid lusts will overflow and they will not be contained in any way. So basically, prostitution was necessary for the society to exist. Now let us look at some more, let's say, legal matters. First of all, the definition of prostitution. Ulpianus, in his commentary to the Julian and Papian law, says, "We hold that a woman openly practices prostitution not only where she does so in a house of ill fame, that is a brothel, but also if she is accustomed to do this in taverns or in other places where she manifests no regard of her modesty." So basically, prostitution could be practiced anywhere. And it was so. There were, of course, brothels just like the one in Pompeii, but also other places like taverns were used for prostitution. For example, in Pompeii we can find quite numerous graffiti advertising prostitution, such as the one advertising one Attica, a prostitute whose cost was 16 asses. Now, although prostitution was legal, prostitutes were socially and later on also legally branded. In Republican times, it was the censors whose competence it was to degrade people socially for unacceptable behavior. And the censors could only punish men in this way, because the so-called nota censoria was only meant for men. And that is why, although women's prostitution was socially reproved, and, for example, it was not advisable for a man from the senatorial order or from the order of the Knights of the Equites to marry a prostitute, still the prostitutes themselves were not formally, at least, branded. Later on, the new notion of infamia was introduced, and in late antique times, in late antiquity, prostitutes were certainly branded with infamy. Firstly, however, probably they were branded with a more informal mark of turpitude, turpitudo. Ulpianus explains, the law brands with infamy not only a woman who practices prostitution, but also one who has formerly done so, even though she has ceased to act in this manner. for the disgrace is not removed even if the practice is subsequently discontinued. So practicing prostitution meant that you were branded for life. And this changed. When? With Theodora and Justinianus. Justinian, before he became emperor, fell in love with Theodora, who was an actress and probably also a prostitute, and he wanted to marry her. That was absolutely impossible, not only with the Republican mores maiorum, meaning that a man from high social strata could not marry such a woman, but also later on with the Augustan legislation on marriage, which prohibited freeborn citizens from marrying such women. Procopius, however, describing Justinian's and Theodora's story, says it was then that he, Justinian, undertook to complete his marriage with Theodora. But as it was impossible for a man of senatorial rank to make a courtesan his wife, this being forbidden by ancient law, that is, the Augustan laws on marriage, he made the emperor nullify this ordinance by creating a new one, permitting him to wed Theodora and consequently making it possible for anyone else to marry a courtesan. This is not entirely true, because if a woman wanted to marry a man from senatorial rank, she had to change her life completely. She had to stop acting and also stop practicing prostitution, and so become eligible for marriage. So basically, thanks to Theodora, quite a lot of women were able to change their fate that was otherwise not so very happy. If we consider the control of the state over prostitution, we have to start with some republican regulations. During republican times, it was the task of the so-called tresviri capitales or tresviri nocturni, minor magistrates, to control prostitution and to make lists of prostitutes. It is confirmed in Plautus's comedies. For example, in one of those, in Asinaria, one of the characters says, "But to your own misfortune, for now, from this spot will I go to the triumvirs," to the tresviri, "and there I'll take care your names shall be." So basically, although the censors could not brand the prostitutes with ignominia, with the loss of good name, with the nota censoria, the triumvirs could put them on a list which was also socially disapproved. Later on, this task was given to the aediles. The aediles, whose responsibility was to take care of the city itself, the so-called cura urbis, were responsible for controlling places that were possibly dangerous. And among those places also brothels. Seneca calls them very beautifully places that dread the visits of the aedile, because he could also always come and control them. Now, what is very interesting, Gellius tells us a story about an aedile who went to a place where a courtesan, where a prostitute exercised her work, either a brothel or her apartment, we do not know. The prostitute was called Manilia and the aedile was Aulus Hostidius Mancinus. Gellius describes that the aedile came to this place as a reveler. So probably he was drunk, it was the middle of the night, and he wanted to enter the place not as an aedile, but as a client. The prostitute didn't want to let him in. He became quite aggressive, and some stones were thrown at him, either by the girl herself or maybe by some slaves. And later on, the aedile brought suit before the people, before the assembly, against the courtesan. We do not know what was the charge, but it could have been violence against the magistrate or even crimen majestatis. We are not sure about this, but definitely it was a very serious charge. And the prostitute went to the tribunes of the plebs. So she exercised her ius auxilii. And the tribunes decided to help her. They issued a decretum stating that the aedile had rightly been refused admission to a place to which it had not been seemly for him to go with a garland on his head. Therefore, they forbade the aedile to bring an action before the people. So basically what the tribunes said was, you are allowed to go there anytime to control the place, so as an aedile officially, but you are not always allowed to get in as a client, only if she wants to let you in. What does it mean? It means that although in legal sources it is usually said that a prostitute was not able to choose her clients, that she was obliged to admit them, it was not always so. She could defend herself if the clients were aggressive or if they wanted to come in a moment when she simply didn't want to let them in. There is another very interesting text in the Controversies by Seneca the rhetorician, where a girl who was kidnapped by the pirates and then prostituted, sold to a procurer and prostituted, made an agreement with every client that they would pay her, but she would not make sex with them. Most clients agreed, but one client, a soldier, was very aggressive. He didn't want to agree. He started fighting with the girl and accidentally she killed him. And she was acquitted. She was acquitted because she acted in self-defense. And it was a normal thing. She could do it. She was allowed to do it. The controversy is, of course, more complicated because possibly the girl was a Vestal Virgin, so the problem was whether she could still be considered a virgin or not. But what is interesting for us is that it was socially acceptable that a prostitute had some rights, that she could defend herself. Prostitution was also extremely advantageous to the state, especially after Caligula introduced a new tax, a tax on prostitution. According to Suetonius, Caligula levied new and unheard of taxes, at first through the publicans and then, because the profit was so great, through the centurions and tribunes of the Praetorian Guard. And the tax was on the earnings of prostitutes, as much as each received for one embrace. And a clause was added to this chapter of the law, providing that those who had never been prostitutes or acted as panders should be liable to this public tax, and that even married persons should not be exempt. So basically it was really it brought huge profits to the aerarium and then to the fiscus, and that's why even Christian emperors used that tax to fund different public enterprises, like, for example, building temples. I've already mentioned Augustus's legislation on marriage. There were some provisions there that were very important. First of all, Augustus tried to or transferred adultery from the field of a private family affair to the field of criminal law. So adultery was considered a crime, it was punished very severely. So it was very important to define what was not considered adultery or stuprum. And intercourses with prostitutes were definitely not considered as adultery or debauchery or stuprum. And that is why in early Principate some women tried to register themselves as prostitutes in order to avoid the penalties introduced by the law. Tacitus describes the case of a certain Vistilia, who was from the equestrian order. She registered herself as a prostitute, and it was a huge scandal. In the same year, Tacitus says, bounds were set to female profligacy by stringent resolutions of the Senate. And it was laid down that no woman should trade in her body if her father, grandfather, or husband had been a Roman knight. For Vistilia, the daughter of a Praetorian family, had advertised her venality on the aediles list, the normal procedure among our ancestors who imagined the unchaste to be sufficiently punished by the avowal of their infamy. Her husband, Titidius Labio, was also required to explain why, in view of his wife's manifest guilt, had he not invoked the penalty of the law. As he pleaded that 60 days not yet elapsed were allowed for deliberation, it was thought enough to pass sentence on Vistilia, who was removed to the island of Seriphos. So basically Vistilia herself was punished, but it was impossible for other women from high social strata to register themselves as prostitutes. Now, there are some other, more, let's say, private legal problems concerning prostitution. The problem was that although prostitution was legal, it was debatable whether what you were paying to a prostitute could be demanded back or not. And we've got an extremely interesting text also by Ulpianus in the Digest. Money paid to a harlot, however, cannot be recovered, as Labio and Marcellus state. But the principle is not the same as the question is not whether there is immorality on both sides, but as it exists only on the part of the giver, as the woman acts in an immoral manner because she is a harlot, but she is not immoral when she accepts the money, since she is a harlot. So, what is the real legal problem here? All the jurists were of the same opinion that money given to a prostitute cannot be demanded back. But at first, most jurists were of the opinion that both the giver, that is the client, and the receiver, that is the prostitute, were acting in an immoral way. But then a new opinion was given by two jurists, by Labio and Marcellus, who decided that it was only the client who was immoral. Because the prostitute, of course, did an immoral thing when she started practicing prostitution. But because she was a prostitute, it was a normal thing for her to accept the money, because prostitution is having sex for money. So it is a very, very interesting example of juristic logic, of the way of thinking of the Roman jurists. Calling a woman of good morals a prostitute was a very serious matter. It could be considered as a delict called injuria. Now we've got another very interesting commentary of the jurist Ulpianus, who says, if anyone should speak to young girls who are attired in the garments of slaves, he will be considered to be guilty of minor offense. And still, if they are dressed as prostitutes, says he, and not as respectable women. Therefore, if a woman is not dressed as a respectable matron, anyone who speaks to her or takes away her female attendant will not be liable to the action for injury. So, injuria could be pleaded only if a man or anyone called a matron who was respectably dressed a prostitute. What does it mean, respectably or not respectably dressed? The prostitutes usually wore men's garments, that is togas, colorful, bright togas. So if you saw a woman wearing a toga, you could be sure that she was a prostitute. And if it was a respectable matron, it was not your fault if you called her a prostitute. There is a beautiful epigram by Marshall who says, "You give your mistress scarlet and violet colored dresses. If you wish to give her suitable presents, send her a toga." Right? So it is an allusion that a girl who is someone's mistress is simply a prostitute. Who were the Roman prostitutes? Some of them were, of course, free women, but most were slaves. And prostituting slaves was a very serious social problem. At first, the owner could do anything with his or her slaves. And of course, prostituting them was one of the possibilities. Later on, however, some legal measures were introduced, and especially it was possible to add a special clause to a sales contract and demand from the buyer not to prostitute the sold slave. Pomponius explains, if you buy a female slave on condition that she shall not be prostituted, in Latin ne prostituatur, and if she shall become free, and you violate the condition of the sale, the slave will obtain her freedom, and you will be in the same position as if you had manumitted her, and therefore you will have no recourse against the vendor. So basically the clause was to be considered valid at any time with any buyer, not only the first one but also subsequent ones, and usually, just as the jurist says, the slave could not be prostituted on the condition that if she is, she becomes free. So if anyone actually did prostitute her, the condition was fulfilled, the slave became free, and the buyer had no recourse to the vendor. As you can see, prostitution posed lots of legal problems in ancient Rome. It is one of the most interesting, fascinating even phenomena from antiquity. There are of course quite a lot of issues that I was not able to discuss, but I do hope that it was interesting for you to find out at least about some problems concerning prostitution in ancient Rome. Thank you very much.